The British Academy welcomes you to this live online event, part of the With Great Power season. This evening we welcome world-renowned political scientist Joe Nye, a corresponding fellow of the British Academy. Professor Nye will explore the concept of political power on the global stage. How does it work between countries and their leaders? What does it really mean to be a global power? Join the discussion on Twitter using the Great Power hashtag and follow @Britac_news. Further details about this event are available at britac.ac.uk.
Event, which is part of a series on With Great Power, Political Leaders, Popular Legacies. And it's a particularly appropriate time to be thinking about the role of power in international relations, as we will hear from Professor Joe Nye. I should explain that I'm Adam Roberts, a mere professor of international relations. Joe Nye glories in the title of Distinguished Professor of International Relations. So there you have the difference. He is a corresponding fellow of this academy. And I can tell you it's even more difficult to get elected as a corresponding fellow than it is to get elected as a fellow. He has written very extensively about a wide range of international issues. He actually began by working on integration, federal schemes, and regional arrangements in East Africa, if I'm not mistaken, and your doctorate was on that subject in his first major book. So his subsequent career has involved a considerable broadening from that to cover international interdependence generally, to cover security issues in the Cold War and subsequently, and indeed changing forms of government. In the last decade, he's written very extensively about US foreign policy and about soft power, a term which he more or less invented, and on democracy in the information age. He's also served at least 3 times in government, in the United States government, as Undersecretary of State for Security Assistance, as Chairman of the National Intelligence Council, and as US Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. So he's one of those academics who can speak with a certain amount of inside knowledge when he talks about decision-making. His work on government and on international relations is conceptually and theoretically very well informed. He's published prolifically, including his book, Is the American Century Over?, in which he argues, it's his most recent book, that the United States, although frequently written off, is not quite down on the floor yet. In addition, he's written a work of fiction, The Power Game. Now, a consistent theme of his writing is his awareness of local roots and political strengths, and his awareness of different perspectives on the world and how they don't change easily. And during the Cold War, he resisted that simplification, which read every conflict as simply being a reflection of the East-West conflict. And he saw that they had local roots, all of which has made him particularly well qualified to think about and comment on the post-Cold War world. His work is calm and reflective, though recent events must make it hard for him to maintain these qualities all the time. He is giving this talk to us, as you know, on the day when at least we at last know who the contenders are likely to be in the US election. He will speak to us now on America's role in the world and election year appraisal. There will be a relatively short introduction by him, then a discussion between him and myself, and then we will go for general discussion and questions. And I should just remind him and you that this discussion is on the record. It's not under Chatham House rules. So be careful what you say. Joe, we're looking forward very much to hearing what you have to say.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Adam, and it's a pleasure to be back in London and to be here at the Academy. I should open with what I gather is proper etiquette in parliamentary procedure, which is if you have an interest, you declare it. And since I'm going to talk about the American election and foreign policy in election year, it's only proper that I say I'm not purely nonpartisan. I am co-chair of Hillary Clinton's advisory group on Asia. So with that warning about my biases, let me launch into my biases. This is an interesting year in terms of trying to understand American position in the world. Donald Trump, the Republican presumptive nominee, has made a slogan out of the term "Make America Great Again." He campaigns with this hat that says "Make America Great Again." That assumes then that America is not great or in decline. And he is able to tap into a high degree of discontent among a large portion of the electorate, not a majority, I don't think, but a significant portion of the electorate that thinks the country is in decline. Now, what should one make of this? One thing to realize is that a belief in declinism, or a view that the United States is in decline, is deeply ingrained in American political culture. If you go back to the founding of what became the United States, the Puritans broke away from the Church of England and broke away from England because they wanted to have a higher standard of worshiping God. And once you set yourself a higher standard, you're bound to create anxiety that you're not living up to it. So even in the 17th century, there was a worry among many of the early founders of the United States that they weren't quite living up to what they'd claimed, to the expectations they'd set. And you see this again when the American founders of the Republic break from the dominant view of monarchy as the appropriate form of government and create a republic. And they immediately begin to worry about whether there'll be a decline in their Republican virtues. And it's interesting to see Washington, and Jefferson, and Hamilton, so forth, Adams, studying the example of the Roman Republic. And they wanted to understand, wow, why was it that the Roman Republic declined? And will the same thing happen to us? So here they are, just having founded a new type of government, and they're already worrying about decline. Charles Dickens visited the United States in the middle of the 19th century and came back with the observation, the Americans are very strange. They're always worried about decline. So it's not new that we have this. In the 20th century, you see it in the period since 1948 or so, 46 to 48, when the United States actually did become the center in the global balance of power. The United States becomes the world's largest economy at about the turn of the 20th century. And after World War I, it becomes crucial to the balance of power. Woodrow Wilson breaks with a long tradition, which is Washington's admonition not to have any entangling alliances. And he sends 2 million American troops to Europe. That tips the balance in the final days of World War I. And then when he fails to set up an international scheme of collective security under the League of Nations, the American troops come back home, and American public opinion turns virulently isolationist in the 1930s. And that leads to one of the worst decades that we've seen, a decade marked by war and genocide, because Britain is not quite strong enough to do what it used to do as being a leader in the global balance of power, and the Americans are not quite responsible enough to pick up the slack. So it really, the turning point, I would argue, in American foreign policy is 1946, and 46 to 48, when Harry Truman, realizing that Britain can no longer provide the power to create a balance in the Eastern Mediterranean, the issue of protecting Turkey and Greece from Soviet encroachment, he basically leaves American troops overseas. And you have the Marshall Plan in 48, the founding of NATO in 49. That's followed in 1960 by Eisenhower creating the alliance with Japan, and in between you've had the Korean War in 1950. And that creates a world in which American military power, for better or worse, depending on your preferences, is central to a global balance of power. And that's basically a very different world than you've seen before that period. So that is very much a turning point. And incidentally, those troops in Europe and Korea and Japan are there to this day. Now, during that period, though, when the United States is central to the global balance of power, there is a concern about decline, and it recurs frequently. So after the Soviet Union puts up Sputnik in 1957, I guess it is, many Americans read this as a sign that the Soviets are passing the United States and that the United States is in decline. Of course, it didn't turn out that way. But there was a widespread belief that when Khrushchev visited the United States and said, "We will bury you," there were many Americans who believed him. And in the 1980s, when Japanese industrial manufacturing technology was very successful in putting many American firms and industries out of work in the middle of the country, the so-called Rust Belt, there were people who said, now the Japanese are 10 feet tall. One of my colleagues at Harvard wrote a book called Japan as Number One. That again doesn't look too proper as an analysis. And after the Great Recession of 2007, 8, when the Chinese, with a stimulus package, managed 10% growth, and the Americans were at negative growth, there was a recurrence of belief in American decline. And there was a public opinion poll taken in 2009 or 10, I can't remember the exact date, in which a majority of the American people thought that China had already or would soon pass the United States as the world's most powerful country. And that declinism, those cycles of declinism, are deeply rooted in American political culture, but also reflect the anxieties that have been accentuated by the pivotal role of the United States in the period after World War II. And I think you can argue that Trump is tapping into something that has deep roots. It's not as though it's something that's passing. Now, I should say, though, that that little rehearsal of history should also tell you something, which is that these cycles of declinism tell you more about American psychology than about power realities. And the Americans are psychologically a strange bunch. This is proof of it. But it is also worth remembering that in politics, it's psychology that counts. It's what people believe, not always the facts. But we might hesitate for a minute and ask, what are the facts? And I would argue that the facts are that the United States is not in decline. And I argue this in the book that Adam mentioned in some detail, Is the American Century Over, with some numbers and so forth. And I'm not going to bother you by rehearsing that now. But I don't think it's a Chinese century, and I don't think there's a country about to pass the United States. And I don't think the country is in absolute decline like ancient Rome either. And just a few examples of why I don't think so. If you look at demography, the United States is the only developed country which is going to, only large developed country, which is going to preserve its ranking in world demographic tables. Today, in size of population, China is 1, India 2, the United States 3. According to UN demographers in 2050, it'll be India 1, China 2, and the United States still 3. That's interesting, and it reflects in part the openness to immigration, which, though we complain about it all the time, fortunately we're not able to stop it. And that is, I think, leading to a demographic strength where the United States will be quite different, let's say, from Russia or Japan or even Europe or even China. Another reason I don't think the United States is in absolute decline might be the turnaround in the situation in energy. 10 years ago, we would have said, well, the United States is becoming hopelessly dependent upon imported energy. And it was true. And then you had the combination of the technology of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, which produced what's called the shale revolution, which suddenly made a huge difference in terms of unleashing gas and oil from shale rock, and that led the International Energy Agency to project that North America might not need to import energy in the 2020s. Now, the current low oil price has dented shale production, but it's poised to recover if oil prices were to go up again. So on energy dependence, I don't see an absolute decline of American power. Another reason would be the issue of technology, that if you look at the technologies which are going to be the leading technologies of this century, you could argue that they will be biotechnology and nanotechnology and the next generation of information technology, big data, the Internet of Things, so forth. And if you ask where is the leadership in the development of these technologies, it's largely in the United States. And then you say, but what's behind or below this? Can it maintain this leadership? If you look at the university structure, there you'll find a pretty strong development of ideas in the universities. Shanghai Jiao Tong University does an annual ranking of universities globally, and of the top 20 universities, they rank 15 of the top 20 as being in the United States. Now, I don't mean to say that the United States doesn't have lots of problems. It does, and I'm going to discuss some of them. But what I'm trying to say is that the view that we need to make America great again because we're in decline is really not factually based. It's psychologically based. Well, with that background, then what do we say about the psychology of the American political campaign and where we are, and what do we think will happen in American foreign policy after 2016? And there you have a very sharp divergence of paths, if you want. If Trump were elected, you would have quite a different foreign policy than if Hillary Clinton were elected. If Hillary Clinton is elected, and I think the probabilities are that she would beat Trump, but we can talk about that in question period if you wish. I suspect that her foreign policy will resemble Obama's foreign policy. After all, she was his Secretary of State in his first term. And I think that you'll have some changes. That there is a view that the American foreign policy under the Obama administration has had a degree of retrenchment, not the same as isolationism, but retrenchment meaning reduction of the risks that are taken and so forth. And that if the George W. Bush period was a period of maximalism, Obama has been a period of retrenchment. And I think some people believe that Hillary Clinton's foreign policy would be a bit less retrenchment than you've seen under Obama. But by and large, I don't think you'd see a big difference in the foreign policy of a Clinton administration from an Obama administration. And if you look at the big issues in American foreign policy, I would argue that they really are Russia, China, the Middle East, and what I call the transnational issues. And on China, which to me is absolutely central, managing the U.S.-China relationship is crucial to a stable century. I think that that Clinton's policy, like Obama's, will be relatively successful. U.S.-China relations are difficult. There are problems right now. But before people get too excited about the South China Sea, which is the heart of the current difficulties, it's worth remembering that of the major issues in U.S.-China relations that beset us 3 years ago, exchange rates, climate, and cyber theft, those three have been relatively well managed. If you compare China and the U.S. at Paris last December to Copenhagen in 2009, you'll see a major improvement. If you look at the Obama-Xi summit last September, they reached a tentative agreement on some of the cyber issues that had been poisoning the relationship. And the exchange rate issue has been largely, not totally, but largely resolved. So of the four major issues, three are not resolved. You don't resolve issues like this, but they've been managed. And I think you can continue to manage. The second big question, Russia, actually worries me because Russia is a country in decline. And the problem with countries in decline is they tend to be risk acceptant, and they take bigger risks. That was the case of Austria-Hungary in 1914. And we don't know what risks a declining Russia will take. And the net effect of that is that we need to take a position which makes clear to Putin that you can't violate the basic norm of 1945, stealing territory from your neighbor by force without paying a price for it. And yet at the same time, we can't isolate Russia. You have to deal with Russia. And getting the balance right on that is very difficult. I would submit that Obama has done reasonably well on that. The third issue that I mentioned was the Middle East. And I'd say this is an area where American power has declined. We have less influence there than we did, but not because of something that's happened in the United States, but because of things that are happening in the Middle East. Namely, in the Middle East, you have a series of overlapping revolutions, geographical, religious, sectarian, and what I would call the revolution of delayed modernization, as described in the Arab Human Development Report. And this is going to create turmoil in my mind, but to my mind, turmoil in the region, I think, for decades. And I don't think the Americans or anybody is going to be able to solve it. But it's going to be something that we're going to have to manage and live with and figure out how to deal with it. So those, to me, are three big regional issues. And notice they're each quite different. And then when you come to what I call the transnational issues, climate change and cyber, particularly as we enter the Internet of Things, where you may have 30 or 40 billion connections to the Internet, which increases the attack surface dramatically, those are issues where we're going to have to develop networks of states able to work together to deal with them. I would argue that on these four things, these four major issues, that Clinton will have a foreign policy which will largely resemble Obama's. So if you want to say, what will American foreign policy look like, you can project. It won't be the same. Events occur, there are differences of style and so forth, but you can project what the future might look like. On the other hand, if we take the other path on this decision tree, which would arise from Trump being elected president in November, then you're faced with a really major divergence. And it's interesting because Trump has made statements. We don't really know what his foreign policy positions are because he hasn't disclosed his advisors and he hasn't given any details on his positions. But the types of things that he has said are the first time in 70 years that you've had a major candidate from a major political party departing from the consensus of the forward-based alliances. Americans have had deep disputes in foreign policy, but they've been about intervention in developing countries, Vietnam, Iraq. But this question that I started with about Harry Truman's decision and the forward presence of American troops and the maintenance of alliances with Japan, Korea, particularly with NATO, that's been a bedrock which has not been challenged. That consensus has not been up for grabs. And for the first time, you have a major candidate who's calling that into question. Trump has said we're going to push the allies. And if the allies don't pay more of their share, we're going to think about reevaluating our position. And when somebody said to him, but does that mean that you want Japan and Korea, South Korea to go nuclear? He said, if that's what's necessary, we're not going to have a taboo on this. And when he's been asked questions about, what about alliance solidarity and loyalty and trust, he said, well, we're going to be unpredictable. And unpredictability is going to give us bargaining power. And so we'll be in a better position. So he hasn't said he'll destroy the alliances, but he said some things which call into question the alliances, which are very different from what his predecessors have said. American presidents for some time have complained about burden sharing in the alliance, or the NATO countries paying their 2% of GDP into defense. I mean, you can find this, but you can't find an American president saying, we're going to quit, or we might pull out, or raising questions about unpredictability. Usually American presidents are in the business of reassuring allies, not saying we'll be unpredictable. So for the first time, we have an election where you're going to see a major divergence in U.S. foreign policy. Non-proliferation has been a key feature of U.S. foreign policy since the 1950s. And the idea that you're calling something like that into question is a big change. So when we look to what American foreign policy will be next year, it really will be quite a difference depending on which road on this decision tree, or which path the electorate chooses in November. Now, I may be wrong on this. It's true that Trump is a pragmatist. It's true that he celebrates the art of the deal. It's true that he would probably be constrained by institutions such as the Congress and the State Department and the military and so forth. So it might be that what we're hearing in the campaign rhetoric sounds more dangerous than what we would see if he were to govern. On the other hand, we don't know, because he has not announced who his advisors are beyond a few people who are essentially operational rather than strategic thinkers. And he has not gone into any depth on what the policy positions are. He will express something, like build a wall and make the Mexicans pay for it, but he doesn't say what that means. What does that mean as a policy, as opposed to an attitude? So we're in a strange situation in American foreign policy where the United States is not in decline, though there is a psychological anxiety that Trump has tied into with this Make America Great Again. And whether the electorate votes in Trump or Clinton could make a very large difference in foreign policy, though we don't know for certain because Trump is not very clear about the details of any of his positions or the people who are advising on it. So I'd like to come to London and to reassure you that all is well and the future will be rosy, but alas, I cannot tell a lie. So having declared my interest and warned you of my biases, I should also tell you that as an analyst, you should be aware of my predictions, because if you'd asked me a year ago, would Trump win the Republican nomination, I would have said no, and I would have been wrong. So you may yet again find that I'm wrong. On the other hand, I've been wrong in very good company. It's very hard to find anybody who's been right. So with that introduction, Adam, let's have a conversation.
My difficulty in having a conversation with Joe Nye is extremely simple. The difficulty is that I generally find myself agreeing with what he said, and that's certainly true this evening. But there's one issue where I think there may be a bit of difference, and that is that, and I put this as a question, is there evidence of a deeper problem in US foreign policy than the one you described? In other words, for example, is the candidacy of Bernie Sanders, as well as of Trump, evidence that twice over we've got candidates standing who stand for something quite fundamentally different from the tradition that you described? And if it was just one of them, you might say, well, this was an outlier. But the fact that two of them have surprised all analysts and got further than anybody dared to predict may suggest that the cumulative effect of having lost in engagements in Vietnam, having run into difficulties in Afghanistan, Iraq having turned out to be a disaster, Libya, problems there too, and so on. The cumulative effect is one of considerable disillusion with the way things have been going under, as it were, the traditional mantra of thought about foreign policy. I'm not saying that their revolutions are purely foreign policy phenomena. There are other things as well. But that anxiety about how US policy has worked out in practice may have fed into the broader anxieties that you mentioned.
Well, it's an interesting point, Adam, that Sanders, like Trump, tapped a broad set of anxieties, but on foreign policy, he took the position of dissent on what you might call the normal issue, which was Iraq and intervention. And he criticized Clinton for supporting the vote on Iraq in 2002, I guess it was. And but he didn't say anything about weakening alliances or questioning alliances. So he didn't dissent to the depth that Trump dissented. But what they both shared, Trump and Sanders, was a rejection of trade agreements, and particularly the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Clinton had supported when she was Secretary of State, but which she backed away from in the campaign because it was so difficult politically. So if there's the big commonality on foreign policy between Trump and Sanders is on the economic foreign policy, which is some people would say this shows that the age of trade agreements is over. In other words, the TPP may be passed in the lame duck session of the Congress after the election, but that it would be very difficult to pass TTIP, the transatlantic trade agreement with Europe, and that that Sanders and Trump both were able to mobilize impressive political support by opposing trade agreements. But Sanders did not oppose alliances. He opposed interventions, but not alliances. So you're right, there is a commonality there, but it was more of appealing to the economic reaction to globalization rather than the alliances.
And just one more issue before we open it up. Do you take the view that even though there hasn't been a change for the worse on the dramatic level that is sometimes portrayed, nonetheless, we do see a certain amount of evidence around of a revival of power politics in forms that some had thought, or at least hoped, were things of the past. I'm thinking of the ways in which Russia has not been satisfied with a permanent status as in the antechamber of NATO as a member of Partnership for Peace, or how China seems to have not quite abandoned, but certainly ceased to mention its policy of the peaceful rise of China, and is now putting much more emphasis on military power and expansionism. In other words, is there something of a revival of great power politics going on in the world, not just in the worrying forms we might have seen in the United States, but also more generally?
Well, I think that's true, though I don't think that it's a total collapse of the post-45 order. And I mean, when Putin used force against another country to take a province, Crimea, if the international community had not replied with sanctions, I think we would have a beginning of disintegration of the post-45 consensus. I mean, the UN may have many flaws, but nonetheless, the Charter of the UN remains a universal document and the bedrock of order. And while it's often observed in the breach by many countries, it's still, I think, essential that when you have something as egregious as Putin's dismemberment of Ukraine, that the fact that you had sanctions was important for reaffirming the order. You say, yes, but we still deal with Russia, and the answer is, in a sense, it's like sanctions against Russia are like the penalty box in a hockey game. You know, the game eventually goes on, but there is a period when you have a player that's in the penalty box. And I think that in that sense, sanctions have worked to reaffirm the basic norm of the order. What's going to be interesting is to see how China deals with the decision of the UN Law of the Sea Tribunal, which is about to come out with this summer with a decision relating to the South China Sea. Philippines has taken the case to the tribunal. China has said it will not pay attention or does not accept the jurisdiction of the tribunal. And it's pretty clear under the Law of the Sea Treaty that you can't pile sand on a rock or a reef and call it an island with a 12-mile territorial sea. And that's why the United States has been sailing ships, warships, within 12 miles of these artificial islands. And so I don't know how that's going to turn out. I think a lot will depend upon whether it becomes more than a US-China dispute. If India, Australia, some European countries also make clear to China that the law of the sea treaty does not allow you to pile sand on a rock and call it an island, then the Chinese, I think, will feel that they are losing face and that they will find some formula to back away from this. If there's not an international response, if it's treated just as part of a US-China dispute, then that might get worse. So I think to some extent, you're right about great power politics, but it also makes a difference whether states cooperate to reinforce those basic norms, whether it be the UN Charter or the law of the sea treaty.
Discussion. Avi Schleim.
A few comments on America's role in the Middle East. You considered that America's influence in the Middle East is declining, and you pointed out that America still has military assets, military power, but its influence is declining. And to use your own terms, I would suggest that America, under the previous administration of George W. Bush, had tremendous military power, but the neocons thought that if America invaded Iraq, it has so much hard power that it would be able to sweep all before it. And the result was that the neocons frittered away America's hard power and also succeeded in compromising its soft power. So Iraq 2003 was an act of, it was a catastrophe at every level. Indeed, it was a criminal act, and Britain, under the insane leadership of Tony Blair, was part of that criminal act. The result was, the upshot was to destroy the state institutions of Iraq and to create chaos. And ISIS was best placed to take advantage of that chaos. And there isn't a single example of successful state building on the back of regime change. Think of Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya. So you said that America doesn't have a solution to the problems in the Middle East today, and I agree with that. But what I would like to suggest to you is that the beginning of wisdom is to understand that we, America and Britain, are largely responsible for creating the conditions that made possible the rise of ISIS.
Well, I mean, you know much more about the Middle East than I will ever know, so I defer to you on this. But I think you're correct that the invasion of Iraq was a strategic disaster. I mean, a terrible mistake. But I'm not, and it's also true, as you say, that destroying the fragile state structures led to the kinds of problems we're seeing in what's sometimes called Sunnistan, that area in the center of between Syria and the rivers. So I agree with you on that, but I think the problems are deeper than that. No, I think our invasion of Iraq was a mistake. I agree with what you say on that, but I think the problems in the Middle East go deeper in the sense, if you read the Arab Human Development Report, which which of course was written by Arabs, it really suggests arrested modernization. If you look at how much scientific literature is produced in the Arab world, if you look at how much trade there is, non-oil trade, with the rest of the world, if you look at how much literature is translated into Arabic, I mean, these are not my numbers. They are numbers that Arabs write about themselves. And this was written before the invasion of Iraq. And I think that Adam has just done a book on the Arab Spring, so you ought to chip in on this and correct me on it. But I think that one of the revolutions that's going on that we called the Arab Spring, somewhat mistakenly, was this deeper revolution of reaction along generational lines to arrested modernization. And that would have occurred whether we'd invaded Iraq or not. So in other words, I don't disagree with you about the invasion of Iraq, but I think there's something else going on in addition. And I think if you add onto that the sectarian schism between Shia and Sunni, which we did contribute to by the breaking of the institutions, I think these are going to take decades to work themselves out. That's why I was pessimistic about the ability to restore order. But Adam, you've written on the Arab Spring. What's your view?
Oh dear, I agree with everything that Joe says again.
Yeah.
But perhaps I should just add that, yes, there are undoubtedly structural problems in many Arab countries which made it difficult to achieve change by primarily internal forces. And that they are really difficult issues that call into doubt that tradition of thought that sees democracy as necessarily expanding its realm from country to country, from continent to continent. In particular, just to give two examples, in the Arab Spring in Bahrain, the central existential problem that was faced was if there was majority rule in Bahrain, the majority of the population there is of the Shia persuasion, and that would be a source of some concern to the neighboring, primarily Sunni country of Saudi Arabia, not least because there is a past tradition of Iranian claims to Bahrain. And in those circumstances, I'm not saying that introducing democracy there or anywhere else is impossible, but you have to face the structural difficulty that majority rule would be likely to cause alarm among other neighboring powers. And the second example I would cite, and it's typical of many others, is Egypt, where it wasn't obvious, having got rid of a dictator, that there was an alternative available, other than the best organized force in the country was the Muslim Brotherhood. And there was not much deep thinking among the protesters in Tahrir Square about how to get from the position of overthrowing a hated ruler to a position of constitutional democratic rule of Egypt. And one of the snags of operating on the basis of, as it were, the Facebook revolution is precisely that you don't have those boring old entities, political parties and political movements with a structure and a leadership which are capable both of calling a campaign into existence, but also directing it, working out its purposes, and also with the power to call off actions when they need to be called off. And the contrast there between the movements in some of the Arab countries and, let us take the example of solidarity in Poland, is really striking. The difference in approach, the care with which solidarity prepared for revolution, and the awareness of how they would need to conduct affairs. Now, I hasten to add that none of it is saying that Arab countries are not suited to democracy. And look at the case of Tunisia, which is the one country that has emerged from the Arab Spring with success. And the main reason for that is not foreign policy issues, it's internal. That the equivalent of the Muslim Brotherhood in Tunisia was willing and made it clear that it was willing to lose an election. And that's the absolute condition of democracy. If you have a force that is not willing to lose an election, or is suspected of not being willing to lose an election, which is what happened in Egypt, then you can't have a democracy. And so it's a long and slow process to get there. The last thing I'd say, just to get back to Joe's initial remarks, is I think there was one very significant difference between, or there is one significant difference between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, and it was precisely, it came out in connection with the Arab Spring, with Hillary Clinton being more aware of the perils of abandoning authoritarian rulers if you didn't know what was going to take their place. And Obama, whose foreign policy has undoubtedly been influenced by the Martin Luther King vision of a non-violent movement succeeding in overthrowing an unjust system or changing an unjust system, Hillary Clinton has been more cautious over that issue and less inclined to rely on rhetoric, more inclined to pursue a policy that might be criticised by some as realpolitik, but had a certain logic to it. Yes, could you give your name?
My name's John Cartledge. When I was studying in the United States in the 1960s, I was interested to discover that at that time, at any rate, most Americans had never seen the sea. I think it's still the case that most American citizens don't have passports. What I'm curious to know is to what extent do the issues that we're discussing here tonight engage the majority of the American population, or to what extent is this the private preoccupation of a sort of tiny self-selected elite? In this country, the polls always show that the issues that most affect most voters when they determine where to cast their votes are things that bear directly on their immediate economic situation. They're concerned about unemployment, they're concerned about housing, they're concerned about education. They may be concerned about immigration, but not as a foreign policy issue, but in terms of its direct impact on their lives. If this meeting was being held in Peoria, Illinois, how many people would show up?
I think your intuition is correct, which is that economic issues and one's pocketbook is probably the most important determinant of how people vote. I think that's true of many democracies. There are some exceptions where foreign policy becomes a dominant issue, but it's rare. So for example, in '68, after Vietnam, foreign policy became a dominant issue in the '68 election. But that's because with the war, you had a foreign policy issue that reached home to Peoria and elsewhere. People then were drafted and were losing lives overseas. In 2006, foreign policy was a dominant issue in the congressional elections, which prepared the way for the election, or the presidential election of 2008. And that was largely because of the war in Iraq, which was very unpopular by that stage. So there are cases where in Peoria and elsewhere in the interior of the country, foreign policy has swung elections. But I would say we should hope that foreign policy doesn't swing elections, because when it does, it's usually something's gone badly wrong. And the fact that most people in a democracy care about how they're doing in their daily lives actually is a good thing. So your insight is correct, but I don't necessarily regard it as a bad thing that Americans tend to vote their pocketbooks.
Yes, Alan Evans.
Thank you. Alan Evans, Chief Executive of the British Academy. I wonder if I could pick up on Adam's point, what he raised in his first comments on the quality of the alternative potential leaders that emerged during the election campaign, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. And I wonder whether it's something about the political recruitment within the USA that a country with so many brilliant people fails to end up with really brilliant leaders emerging. And I would welcome your comments on whether you agree with me that the system as such, whereby you either have to be unemployed or willing to spend a whole year trudging around the country in support of votes, you have to have personally or be willing to raise an almost limitless amount of money for your campaign, and you have to be willing to put yourself and your family through the media grilling over that year. It doesn't particularly lend itself to getting some of the best leaders putting themselves up to become president of the USA, and that seems to me slightly depressing for the emergence of future leaders of the greatest nation in the world.
Well, I think that is a real concern. If many Americans envy Britain with the sharp and short limits on campaigns. On the other hand, Britain is a much more centralized society. I mean, London is much more important in Britain than Washington is in the United States. And with a continental scale federal system, the elaborate, long process of testing candidates state by state around the country does have something to be said for it. So it'd be nice to import the British system for the sake of the candidates, but I don't know that it would work in the United States. I think, though, one thing that's sometimes said about the American system is that it's been dominated by money, and it's just the rich candidates buying the election. I think what's interesting about this year is that that's not the case. Bernie Sanders was a socialist from Vermont who did not have large financial backing. He raised his money in small contributions. And that's interesting because it doesn't fit the usual caricature of the rich billionaire who takes over a political campaign or party. And on the Republican side, though Trump is a billionaire, what's interesting is he didn't spend his own money. The intriguing thing about the Trump campaign was its ability to manipulate the communications system to have free publicity. So that Jeb Bush, who a year ago, if we'd been having this meeting, would have been seen as the favorite because he had raised the most money. He was seen as having raised $100 million. Actually didn't prevail. And Trump, though he prevailed, didn't spend very much of his own money or raise much money. He succeeded by using the skills he developed on reality TV. You're fired, doing outrageous statements. Combining that with the 24/7 news cycle of cable TV, meaning that Fox and CNN and others are constantly seeking content. They've got to fill these empty airwaves and sell advertising. And then you add on to that manipulation of social media so that you do things on Twitter to reinforce it. So what you do is you say something outrageous, and before the serious press can catch up with you, the Times or the Post or the Wall Street Journal or so forth, You're already on cable news, and you are reinforcing it with tweets, and you are sucking all the oxygen out of the communication system, which is what happened to Bush and Rubio and others. So that Trump was able, according to one estimate that was published in the New York Times, was able to get the equivalent of $2 billion of free airtime. Whereas Bush, the so-called rich candidate, raised 100 million. In other words, Trump just swamped him in terms of dominating the media. And that's a different politics. That's a change. I mean, the view that if I raise enough money, I can solve things has now been devalued. I think it's actually very bad for our political discourse. I'm not happy with this, but I think it's important that as we diagnose what happened this year, we realize that we have to look at the system of communication, modern communication, and the way it can be manipulated. What'll be interesting is whether this is an aberration in 2016 or whether we'll see the same sort of thing in 2020, and we just don't know yet.
Yes.
It's Fergus. So over the past couple of years, we've seen the rise globally, not just in America, of populist right-wing leaders. And I was just wondering, in your opinion, to what extent is immigration a cause of the rise in support for people like Donald Trump, and also how you feel like America, as well as other nations in Europe, should be dealing with the growing migrant crisis?
Well, immigration is certainly an issue that Trump has used, and he's used it successfully to tap a wave of support. The U.S. situation is a little bit different from Europe in the sense that the United States is a country of immigrants, and except for a very small percentage of Americans, we're all immigrants. And that has a long history. And the long history includes a resistance of those who already got there to those who want to get there. There's a great temptation to sort of pull up the ladder after you get there. But fortunately, it doesn't work. So Benjamin Franklin, one of the founding fathers, complained bitterly about the dirty Germans. And in the middle of the 19th century, there was a party, the Know Nothing Party, who wanted to keep out Irish. And by the end of the century, you had people who wanted to keep out Italians or Jews. And then we had an Asian Exclusion Act. I mean, the United States has gone through all sorts of contortions resisting immigration. But fortunately, we're not very good at it. And the net effect of that is that we're able to attract wonderful people from around the world, which is what's made the United States. So you can come to the United States and become an American very quickly. And even if you're going to encounter some resistance, as Trump is now countering or using resistance to Hispanics, particularly Mexicans, but it fortunately it doesn't work. I cite in this little book I mentioned is The American Century Over, a comment I had with, or conversation I had with Lee Kuan Yew, the former Prime Minister of Singapore. And I said, do you think that China will pass the United States? And he said, no, because China can draw on the talents of 1.3 billion people, but the U.S. can draw on the talents of 7 billion people, and it can then recombine them in a diversity which enhances creativity in a way that ethnic Han nationalism can never do. So immigration is something we complain about all the time, and that gives rise to political movements that prey on that, but it's also the source of American strength. And if Americans actually turned against immigration seriously, it would be, in effect, shooting ourselves in the foot. But I don't think we're going to be able to do that. And I think that the United States will continue to remain a country of immigration. That's much more difficult in many European countries which don't have a tradition of immigration and yet have significant immigrant populations, and where there is much more political resistance to immigration, and it's a much harder problem to solve. And you find that in some European countries which don't have large immigrant populations. Some places in Eastern Europe, for example. And I think the politics of immigration, which are very difficult in many European countries, are different from the economics. Would Europe benefit from more immigrants? The answer is yes, because demographically Europe is in decline. But what happens when you suddenly have a country which has defined itself by a certain type of ethnicity, which then has to adjust to very, very different cultural habits of people who are arriving? This is politically much harder. In the United States, we've been complaining about it, but doing it for centuries. In many European countries, it's newer and harder to adjust to politically. So there is a common problem of resistance to immigration and right-wing populism as part of that resistance to immigration. I think it's a little harder in Europe than it is in the US because of the different nature of the historical backgrounds.
I think there was an element in the question, correct me if I'm wrong, of inquiring what was the adequacy of the response both of the United States and Europe to the current immigration crisis as we witness it daily in the Mediterranean. And I wondered if you'd like to comment on that.
Oh, I think the American attitude, I think the person who deserves the greatest credit on this is Angela Merkel. Her acceptance last summer of Syrian refugees in particular, I think was a heroic statement, but it's also cost her politically. It cost her very much in Germany, but it was the right thing to do. In the United States, it's been much harder to take Syrian refugees in because there has been a fear of terrorism which has been inordinately disproportionate. So many Americans think if you take in a Syrian, you're taking in a terrorist. And this is nonsense, but if you go back to this media and 24/7 news, if you're seeing on television all the time one or another terrorist incident, you can imprint in people's mind the view that terrorism is a real and growing threat, even if the objective probabilities of being killed by a terrorist in the United States are lower than the probabilities of being killed by a falling tree limb. That's happened to be factually true.
Yes, or even drowning in a bath, I believe.
Or drowning in the bath.
Yes, gentleman there.
Thank you. John, history and politics teacher. Just interested in your conception of the causes of Americans' projection of power post-1945 in the world order. Is this based mostly on the conception that they are a land of opportunity and economic meritocracy, or is this based on the idea that they're a city on the hill with the ideal liberal values that we should all aspire to? And just, I'm interested as well in the recent aversion to interventionism from these experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan. Is that based on a challenge to this, the universalization of those values? And Sanders and backing away from intervention abroad, also, is there a problem in American inequality and that although it's got those fantastic universities that you mentioned, there's less social mobility, and that is actually challenging America's conception of themselves as someone that we should all emulate and aspire to?
Well, a lot of the problems that you mentioned are real, but they've also been around for a long time. And it's worth remembering that the debate about to what extent we should intervene in other countries was probably first expressed clearly by John Quincy Adams in relation to the Greek War of Independence. I think it was 1821 or so, in which he said, "We go not abroad in search of monsters to destroy." He said, "We are the defenders of liberty. We wish others well with liberty, but we're not going abroad to provide that liberty to others." So one strand of American policy for a very long time has been, we are devoted to liberty, but we're not going to intervene to produce it. There's another strand of policy which is more messianic, which says we will defend liberty abroad. It's sometimes associated with Woodrow Wilson and Wilson's intervention in Mexico, for example. But the view that we will spread democracy, that that's our mission, to spread democracy. And those two traditions have been in conflict with each other for a long, long time. And it doesn't mean that Americans are better at liberty or better at democracy. There's often a degree of hypocrisy involved in this. But the tension in the culture about how you balance these things out is constantly present. And this is why when I mentioned that we have periods of maximalism and periods of retrenchment, it really is waves of this type. Stephen Sestanovich at Columbia University has written quite a good book on this. I think he calls it Maximalist. And, I think the Americans do more damage when they're in the maximalist mode than when they're in the retrenchment mode. But Avi mentioned earlier neocons who were maximalists, who felt that if you're going to deal with the problems of the Middle East, you had to go all in. And we still have those problems. So what you're describing, it's not going to go away. This is going to be like this for a long time.
Ziba Moshever.
Hello. Yes. Well, Adam said who I am. So, but these days, intervention has got a very bad name, obviously, for practical reason. But we also forget the fact that if it wasn't for American intervention in Europe and East Asia, the whole world would have been a very different place. So the difference is also the fact that at that time, American power was great enough to give the resources and ability to put the resources where their mouth was. So the best example is, as you mentioned, is Marshall Plan, NATO, and with East Asia, they've done exactly the same thing with Japan, Korea, and so on and so forth. So there were lots of guarantees and resources dedicated to that program. Whereas in more recent, less successful interventions, There were none of those, including in Afghanistan and obviously Iraq and Libya and the rest of it. So which one is to be blamed? Is it American power, which is a lot less than what it was, or the world has changed altogether and nobody can play that kind of role anymore?
Well, that's a very interesting point. The Americans have not always intervened or done things for altruistic reasons. I mean, the Marshall Plan had an element of altruism in it, but it was also designed to prevent the Soviets from controlling Europe, and that was a balance of power reason. So it's not that the Americans are purely altruistic when they've intervened successfully. On the other hand, if the dominant power, sometimes people call it a hegemon, I think that is a glorified phrase, but if the power that is most central to the global balance of power is a liberal power in its political culture, it leads to a different world than if the dominant power is an illiberal or authoritarian power. So imagine a world in 1945 in which the Soviet Union had prevailed. I mean, imagine that the Americans had gone isolationist and stayed out of the war. Stalin had finally defeated Hitler, and Stalin had then controlled Europe all the way to the Atlantic, the way he controlled Eastern Europe, including Britain. It'd be a very different Britain today, and a different France as well. So I think that the nature of the dominant power and the balance of power does make a difference, even if the motives are not altruistic. Or another example would be South Korea. The United States supported the PAC regime and other regimes that were dictatorial in South Korea. On the other hand, South Korea today is a vibrant democracy with real elections. North Korea is not. So I think one need not attribute the altruism to the Americans to say that it still makes a difference that the dominant country in terms of the balance of power is a country with a liberal political culture as opposed to an authoritarian political culture. Now, has that American power changed? Well, I think, to go back to my earlier point about the Middle East, I don't think the Americans have the power to control revolutions in the Middle East, as I described it earlier, because of what's happening in the Middle East. In Europe, and after 45, you had countries which had been democracies, which had fought a war, which were devastated, but which were trying to recover, and which had a political culture which could absorb or adopt these liberal ideas. There was a Norwegian political scientist who said that what you had in Europe after World War II was empire by invitation. That may be a little dramatic, but there's something in it. You know, Iraq was not empire by invitation. And I don't think if you said, well, why don't the Americans go in and sort things out in Syria? I don't think we have the capacity to do it. And it's not because we're weaker. It's because the situation is very different. So I think the situation in the Middle East today does not lend itself to that type of liberal hegemony, as Eikenberry calls it, that Europe after 45 or Korea after 50 was susceptible to.
Yes, lady here.
My name is Dishita, and you mentioned soft power and international relations at the beginning. And based on that, I wanted to ask, how effective do you think soft power is in today's world, i.e. 21st century international relations?
Well, soft power is one element of power. It's the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion and payment. And there's certain circumstances where it's more successful and some circumstances where it's less successful. And in most circumstances, you need both hard and soft power resources, which I call smart power, the ability to combine the two in a way that reinforce each other. But to give you a recent example of a successful movement in foreign policy, which was primarily soft power, was Obama's recognition of Cuba, which greatly enhanced the United States position, not just in Cuba, but throughout Latin America. Virtually no hard power relationship in that at all.
Yes.
Hi, Jonathan McClory from Portland Communications and an associate...
Mr. Soft Power.
Well, hardly. And down the street at the Institute for Government as well. If we, notwithstanding Cuba, if we take the Iran deal as perhaps the flagship foreign policy initiative of the Obama administration, what do you think the equivalent would be for a President Hillary Clinton? What would be her flagship initiative? And might a President Clinton be in a better position to actually restart properly the Israeli-Palestinian peace process again?
Well, I should preface, since it relates to the prior question, that Jonathan is about to issue next week an index, the soft power index of the top 30 countries in terms of soft power, where Britain comes out again number one.
Well, you'll have to wait.
Well, you have to wait and see. Anyway, but keep your eyes peeled if you're interested.
You heard this
in
first at the British Academy. Yes.
Keep your eyes peeled, because for the soft power, answer to your soft power question, you're about to get the index next week. But anyway, to go back to your question, Jonathan, I think the Iran deal was a considerable success for Obama's foreign policy, and also Hillary Clinton contributed to that in her term as Secretary of State. I'm not sure, I mean, whether there's something that she has up her sleeve that could follow that, I don't know. Obama came into office with an aspiration, which he expressed early on, of trying to improve relations with countries where they were difficult, namely Iran and Cuba. And I would say that he succeeded in both those cases. On the other hand, I'm not sure that he succeeded with Russia. I don't know whether Hillary will have a situation where she can do what Obama did or not. It'll depend on events, I think. But I'm not aware of any plan that she has, at least at this stage.
One last question, gentlemen.
The House of Representatives serves terms of 2 years. So subsequently, in regards to domestic politics, is the US restricted to short-term development of internal issues rather than the long-term?
Well, yes, but I don't think it's unique to the United States. I mean, when the Founding Fathers set up the American institutional framework, they deliberately made the House very responsive to public opinion by having it elected every 2 years. But they shared power between a House and a Senate, where senators were elected every 6 years. and then a president was in between with 4 years, which was renewable. So the idea of the framers of the American Constitution was to make government responsive, and because of via the House with the 2 years, but have another part which was less responsive by having a 6-year term. On the other hand, I don't know that really is solved the problem. In other words, it's true that if you're in the House, you're raising money for your next campaign about the day after you were elected. So that does affect short-termism. But on the other hand, it's not clear. Some senators can take a longer perspective, but it's not clear that that they're that much long-term in their perspective. I think it's a constant problem in all democracies that we all tend to let the urgent drive out the important. And in many cases that may not matter, but there's some cases like climate change where the relevant time horizons are quite long, and the time horizons of elections are, whether they're 2 years, 4 years, or 8 years, are much shorter. And that, I think, is the type of question that we need to think more about. How do you get people to think about issues that have long time horizons, like climate change, when elections, whether they're 2, 4, 6, or 10 years, are much shorter? And it's hard to do. The Martin School at Oxford issued a report that Pascal Lamy and some others collaborated on. The report was called The Long Term, and it was addressing this problem. How do you get democracies to think about the long term? And the short answer is it's not easy.
Well, on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I think we have to bring things to an end. Some of you are new to this building, and perhaps I should remind you that this part of the building was once William Gladstone's house, Prime Minister of this country, and indeed he lived here when he was Prime Minister some of the time. Among the many debates that undoubtedly took place here were debates about the issue that, above all, characterized Gladstone's premiership, the question of intervention or non-intervention. He showed a lively awareness of the perils of intervention, except when it came to Bulgaria, where he suddenly became an enthusiast for it. These have always been difficult questions. Joe has enlightened us greatly this evening about questions of foreign policy in the contemporary world. And I don't know about you, but I find it reassuring to be reminded that the Trump phenomenon in all its glory is not entirely new, and that the know-nothings before him put him in a great tradition. So thank you, Joe, for that, and thank you all for coming and for your excellent contributions to the discussion. Please give Joe a warm thanks. But before we do, can I just check, are there drinks to be had afterwards? No. Sorry about that. But many thanks to you, Joe, for your presentation.
Thank you for joining us at the British Academy for this evening's event. Join us for our next live online event, Is Social Media the New Political Leader?, at 6 p.m. on the 15th of June. See our website, britac.ac.uk, for details of more forthcoming events in the With Great Power season at the British Academy.